Bringing you the rigs, the trucks, the laboratories, and offices, this is the Oil and Gas Contractors Connect podcast with your host, Ryan Ray.
Welcome to another edition of the Oil and Gas Contractors Connect podcast. Ryan Ray here as always. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today we have on another guest as always, and this is someone I got to meet. What was it? It was
before Christmas, right?
Yeah, before Christmas, right after Thanksgiving. I was up in Denver and got the pleasure of meeting Lee Denke, who is the owner of the Platte River Group out of LaSalle, Colorado, and sat down at a pretty cool little coffee shop there up in Denver is where we were at, and had a good chat, and so wanted to get you on the show today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me on your podcast.
It's always good to catch back up with you. So, Platte River Group, let's just kind of start 30,000 feet. Who are you guys? What do y'all do? And where do you kind of fit into the oil and gas space at?
Well, Platte River Group is up here in LaSalle, which is just a little south of Greeley, which is the big town that everybody recognizes outside of Denver. I guess Denver is the really big town. Greeley is right in the heart of the oil patch up here. Platte River Group has a couple of different ventures going. We do facilities engineering, so design of tanks, pipes, and pumps. And the other venture that we have going is training, and have done Oilfield 101, which is a backgrounder for people coming into the oil field or people who've been in the oil field and they know one aspect of the business, but they need to flesh out their knowledge of the rest of the business. So those are the two main ventures that we have going.
So let's separate those out. We'll talk about the training in a second. Let's just kind of step back. Being in Colorado, obviously there is some oil and gas work going on there. But do you find it's, obviously I'm down here in Texas, so it's more of a hotbed, but what do you find working in somewhere like Colorado? What are some of the challenges that you might face that are unique, and how do you guys deal with those?
Well, the challenges in Colorado are somewhat unique in that the oil and gas is right in the middle of all the urban sprawl, at least here on the east side of the mountains. And then on the west side of the mountains, there is some urban sprawl also, and there's, I guess you could say, some people who are not as receptive to oil and gas as you might find in Texas. I think there's some of the same challenges you might find in, I guess, the Eagle Ford area, which I've never actually been to that area, but I understand there's quite a bit of urban development there. You've just got to have your thinking cap on when you go to propose a new development. Realize you're going to need to propose it not just to the Oil and Gas Commission, but also to a city or a county. It's kind of the same kind of thing I dealt with when I worked out in California. You're going to have to work with the public and make them aware from an early stage what it is you're proposing, and you're also going to have to pay attention to aesthetics, to the way that you're going to mitigate sound and light from your projects. You're going to have to really be on top of those things.
Yeah, what about when you're dealing with maybe staffing issues, or dealing with the general public, because it is a little bit more, as you mentioned, adverse, if you will, than again in somewhere like Texas. How do you get to handle those things as a consultant and as an advisor with your clients?
Are you talking staffing issues as far as just general staffing? I would say that's the same anywhere. Just finding people is a challenge. As far as finding people that can work with the general public, you're just going to have to interview for that, kind of sound out what are people's attitudes for that at the beginning of the project. I think you find that people here are accustomed to it. People know that they're going to have to work with the public when they go into the projects.
Right. Yeah, no, I guess my question is, in Texas, if you look at it, you say, well, you can just about approach anyone in Texas and talk about oil and gas without fear of, I'm sure there's some people who really hate it in Texas, but in somewhere like Colorado, or I'm sure like California as well, where maybe it's not as pro oil and gas, to put it nicely, as it is here in the great state of Texas. How do you guys, advise clients, or when you're dealing with a client and you got to go to maybe a city council meeting or dealing with the public side of the equation? How do you guys handle that?
If you have a city council meeting, you've got a couple of different different scenarios. If you go to the city council meeting, they generally will have a time for people to get up and speak their piece, and people will sign up ahead of time, and each person will have generally a 3-minute slot to speak their mind on it and whether they're for it or against it. And they generally keep that pretty organized. I've been to some where they have had security. They'll have a private security company or the police from that particular town. And those are the ones that are more controversial. In general, you don't have people that get out of hand. People in general are pretty respectful.
Okay.
They do keep those real organized. You do want to be, when you put up a PowerPoint or something, you want to vet that ahead of time. Have a look at what you're putting in there. When you work with city staff, if you're meeting with them to review an engineering proposal, regardless of their personal opinion, in general, they're going to be professional. They're going to look at it with respect to the regulations, and they're going to say, okay, this does or it doesn't meet our requirements. And if you have, say, an increase in the number of trucks or an increase in the number of cars going there, they may require you to put in a turn lane or something like that. But they're going to compare it to their requirements.
Right. Now, you are in the upstream portion is your main portion of the industry that you're consulting in, right?
That is correct. What I'm seeing more and more is that people are pulling in midstream, and midstream and upstream are starting to blend together. So, for example, I'm seeing more people that have a need for fractionation. They're saying, okay, the gas plant is part of the upstream, and in particular, I've got a client, and it's new for me. I had a guy call from Nigeria, and he says, okay, we need some training for operators, and their version of upstream encompasses the gas plant and encompasses way more stuff in midstream than we would think. So it's mostly upstream, but there's some midstream in it.
Yeah, that is interesting. You know, when you talk about upstream and you talk about drilling and E&P stuff, you got to be careful because some of these companies, as you mentioned, they do incorporate the pipelines and the things like that. So you, if I remember correctly, when we talked up in Denver, one of the things that you kind of really enjoy doing is planning out where the wells should be drilled, the spacing and things like that. Kind of walk me through, what are some things that maybe that you see that you kind of, that give you the enjoyment or the satisfaction or maybe the expertise to do something like spacing out wells and planning out a long-term development for a field?
Sure. I mean, usually your geologist is going to do the actual spacing, and they'll come to somebody like me and they'll say, okay, we've got a couple different projects we're evaluating. We've got these wells that we could drill over here, these ones we can drill over here, and we think our production would be XYZ from each one of them. Give me the drilling and facilities costs for these two so that I can feed it back into my economics. And that'd be your geologist and your reservoir engineer. Generally, one person wouldn't handle both of those. You'd either be drilling, completions, or facilities, whichever. They'd give it to somebody like me that does more of the mechanical aspect of it, and we would go off and figure out what it's going to take to do one or another of those aspects and look at, okay, we're going to need to either beef up the facilities in that particular area or put in facilities from scratch, figure out what that's going to be, give them the cost back. So it's there's a bit more to it than just, we're going to go out there and survey the area and say, okay, we need a few tanks. You've got to go in, take their flow rates, whatever it is, make yourself a process flow diagram in general, come up with what they call a piping and instrumentation diagram that will have all your pipe sizes, all your instrumentation. At that stage, you generally would not go to the point of making your diagrams that you would hand off to your craftsman, say your piping layout, your electrical layout, that kind of thing. But you would get your piping and instrumentation diagram, P&ID, and you'd do sort of a factored estimate from that and hand that back to your reservoir and geology people so that they could do their estimation and their economics. So that kind of thing is the process that I've been involved with the most.
What are a couple things that maybe you always advise clients? For instance, we obviously do land surveying, and so one of the things that we say is, okay, land surveyors, we have certain duties and responsibilities, but one of the things is ultimately the courts will decide on who actually owns the property, and the surveyor will give an opinion. And so we come across certain situations, and so we'll advise clients to go ahead and what we call double pay. So pay landowner A and pay landowner B. That way, if the court rules against one landowner or the other, you're kind of covered. That's kind of something always on top of our mind. We're coming across property issues. What are some issues like that you see in what you're dealing with, where you're always kind of advising clients, hey, we see this, be careful about that. Not to be too technical, but maybe some high level things that you're always going into a project looking for the bear trap, if you will.
Yeah, I think surveying is a real good example. It's something you do that's the base for the project, and it's something that you always want to do. And you see people, and when I was a young engineer, I would try and do this, and I hate to admit it to a surveyor, but you see people that say, well, do we need this ding-dang survey? Yeah, you do, because it tells you if you're going to be able to gravity feed from your tanks one to another, or if you're going to need to pump. So getting your basic data up front in the design is just super, super important. So know, for example, what is your water salinity? Is that's going to determine whether you're going to have to re-inject it, or can you recycle it? Is there something else you can do with it that tells you your possibilities for that? Know something about your oil. Do you have sulfur in it? Are you going to have to remove sulfur from your oil or your gas? Know these kind of basic things up front and get a good design basis at the front of the project, and the rest of it will flow from there. So that, I think, really is the main, trap that people fall into with these projects, is not getting enough data up front. I think that's one of the biggies. And then follow that same process that I described. Like, make your basic diagrams, your process flow diagram, your P&IDs, your diagrams that you give to your craftsmen. Every one of those has a purpose. And if you're thinking, well, why do we make all these sets of diagrams? Well, just ask your engineering firm, why is it we're making this diagram? And trying to ask them in a nice way, not like, oh, why is it we make these diagrams? But what's the purpose of this diagram? And they'll tell you, like your PFD, that's to make your sizing for all your stuff, and your P&ID fleshes that out and gets it to the point where you can start making your diagrams for your craftsmen. But there's a reason why you have what looks like a bunch of diagrams that all show the same thing.
Right.
But yeah, follow that same process that people follow, and don't try to reinvent a new process. I guess that would be.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because so often in oil and gas, we as contractors and vendors, we get so busy that we don't always think about explaining to the client why we're doing what we're doing. And part of that is the client is saying, we want it done, we don't care, we want it done,
Mm-hmm.
And so we get so busy that we really kind of forget we do things for a reason. And
Yep.
For us, I mean, it kind of sounds cliche, but for us, we're always doing those things, so we kind of forget, oh yeah, we might need to explain why it is we do these things. And sometimes, listen, clients are like, we don't care why you're doing it, just get it done as long as it's done okay. But you are right, there is kind of that mentality that we need to always be checking our processes and our procedures, because we do things that looks like duplicate work, or we do things that looks like, well, it's extra work, or if you're your T&M company, maybe, well, you're just trying to pad the billing, or if you're a comp, you're doing something on a lump sum, you're trying to get a change order. So that's a great little tidbit there. One of the things I think, and I always talk to my salespeople and my staff about, is when you're in oil and gas and you go meet someone new, it feels like in the community, the first thing people really want to know is are you one of us? So how long have you been in the business? Who do you know in the business? And what do you know about the business? That seems to be kind of the ground in which we play. And I don't work in other industries, so I don't really know how it goes there, but that seems to be here. You teaching these classes, to me, I really like that idea, because that kind of validates your position as someone in the market who understands it. And to be quite frank with you, to be able to teach something, it sounds easy, but to be able to communicate stuff at a level that's understandable, and it's not about intellectual level, it's just to be able to communicate an idea where people can understand it, is a very complicated task. So I think that's a great thing that you're doing. So tell me what got you into that. And I know you mentioned kind of old 101 and 201, you kind of touched on that, but what exactly are you teaching in those classes?
It was, when I first started doing it, I was working for Era Energy out in California, and they had hired about 40 summer hires, and each one of them would come by my desk. I was in the drilling department, and they would come by my desk, and each one of them would ask me the same kinds of questions over and over, and I wasn't able to get anything done. But I thought, well, somebody's got to help these people. So I took a drilling history, and I sat down and made a PowerPoint out of it, and I gathered them all up and went through and explain that drilling history to them. And that's kind of how I got started in teaching this Oilfield 101 class. And that's still important. There still are a lot of people who need to know how to go through a drilling history and a well file and that kind of thing. What's kind of expanded in the last couple months on me is I've got a class I've got to develop, the one for Nigeria. They have actually a lot of the same concerns as we have here. They've got a big push to reduce flaring, install pipeline infrastructure, which is the same as Texas. They've got a bunch of gas plants and refineries they need to put in. And they've got a lot of mitigation of impacts on communities. The best fishing areas, the best other commercial areas overlap. They're co-located with their oil fields, which is the same as the DJ, the Eagle Ford, Marcellus, the California stuff. So they've got to find some way to mitigate impacts on the communities. They've picked a lot of their low-hanging fruit. If you look at their facilities that they've got gas plants, they've got automation and SCADA, they've got big processing plants. So the next thing is, to just take all the people that are working for them and bring up their levels so that they can look for the bigger pieces, look at the overall process and how can we go for bigger ideas, stuff like lean thinking or something like that. How do you apply these bigger conceptual things to that process? And that's the big task for them. And so how to manage that, and then looking at training for EUCI, that company that I've done a lot of training for, wants to go out to Midland. And what's different out there? Well, it's water, and more water. That's what it looks like. And how do you manage that? And there's no easy answers there either. How do you manage all that water that's coming out of the ground? So it's just, those are kind of some of the challenges in training. It's looking at the DOG out in California, the Division of Oil and Gas. They have to make all their inspections consistent across a pretty big state. They want to make sure all their facilities inspectors are consistent. It does a couple things. It preserves the industry's social license to operate. So those guys need to go around and make sure there's not some screw up just waiting to happen and look for that. But then at the same time, make sure they don't have somebody that's, if you will, a hard ass that's being too strict. Make sure it's just consistent. Everybody knows what they're looking at.
So can you solve the water problems for us today?
I'd like to say I could, Ryan. I just, I think it's just everybody's got to be aware of how things are out there. There's problems like you inject down one well, it comes up out of the well they're drilling. How do you manage that? It's not the same people managing the injection as it is that are doing the drilling.
So let's talk real quick about the composition of these classes, because our audience is kind of all over the map here with where they're at in the industry. If you said, okay, hey, these classes, and you can break down the different classes if you want to, these classes are really for people who want X, and these classes are people who want this. I know you've told me before kind of who your audience actually is that shows up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not other people who might benefit from this that aren't really thinking in those terms.
Yeah, the people that over the last few years I've been getting are people from the business side, some more accountants, insurance people. I've been getting a lot of lawyers, people from regulatory. I taught a class in Houston and I had a couple of different companies bring their regulatory teams to get them trained. And that's what I have been getting. And it looks like for these next few classes, it's going to be a lot more operations people, operators. And so I'm going to have to shift the focus of the classes over. Just whoever they throw at me, that's who I'm going to train. So that's kind of where I'm going with it.
Okay. All right. So let's kind of recap all this. We started with what you do. Let's kind of go back there again. So we have two different kind of entities. I mean, you're the owner of the Platte River Group, but you have your consulting side, you have your training side. If people want to find out information about one or the other or both, where do they need to go? How would you direct them to do that?
I guess the best way to find me for the consulting work is through LinkedIn. Look for Lee Denke on there. And probably the training side is OF for Oilfield, oftrain.com. or look up on LinkedIn for me also for that.
And we will link to your LinkedIn page and the OF Train website in the show notes for the listeners who might want to check that out. You just did a course, I know, down in Houston, as you mentioned. We're recording this, and it will be released at a later date, so we're recording this early February, and so I know you just did one down in Houston. So be sure to check the website for those upcoming events and connect with Lee on LinkedIn. Lee, thank you so much for your time today, and to the listeners, keep climbing.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.